Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Quest for Truth. Now, the last little while, we've been doing a few different things, but we're going to kind of change up the way that we're doing it. So now we're going to start these videos in parallel with our Bible study. So we're going to jump in, skipping the first 5 chapters of Luke, and jump in at Luke chapter 6 today. So obviously, missing a lot in the first 5 chapters is quite a bit of a buildup that Luke does in first explaining who God is, or Jesus is, who he is God and man. In the first 3 chapters are very much Jesus is man, but he's also God. There's something more than just the manhood about him. And then in chapter 4, you see the temptation of Jesus and the beginning of his ministry. And then as we go on, we start to see his healing and casting out demons. And then in chapter 5, verses 12 through 16, we see this, that he's not just healing now, but he actually cleanses a leper. So that kind of begins where he's starting to actually interact with the law. And then right after that, starting in verse 17, we see these 4 or 5 interactions with the Pharisees that Jesus has. And so the Pharisees are questioning him and his, like, where his ability to heal comes from, and then we see that he forgives sins, and along the way we see his disciples following him, which will come up here. But right before what we looked at last week was this idea of something new, the old wineskins, the new wineskins, the idea of you have to set aside what you look at in the old covenant to fully accept what Jesus is bringing in the new covenant. And then Luke chapter 6, 1 through 5 say this: Now it happened that he was passing through some grain fields on a Sabbath, and his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating the grain. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answering them, said, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests alone, and gave it to his companions? And he was saying to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So the disciples and Jesus are walking through a grain field on the Sabbath, and they get hungry. So they begin to eat the grain that's there, that's grew up, which which is not against the law. That's something that was allowed by the law, and so they were eating to fulfill their hunger that they had. And then we see kind of this, the fourth time that the Pharisees come out and question Jesus. They say, "Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Now they're talking to Jesus, but it's kind of unclear if Jesus was doing this as well. But the Pharisees are essentially putting what the disciples were doing upon Jesus, and that's something that's very common during this time of, if you if you're this guy who has these disciples and they do something, then that is attributed to you. And so they go right to him and say, hey, why are you doing this? Why how are you really like allowing these people that you're supposed to be teaching and leading to be doing something that we deem to be unlawful on the Sabbath? And then Jesus kind of reaches back into the Old Testament for this example of David. When he was hungry, he went into the temple and ate of the consecrated bread that wasn't meant for anyone to eat except for the priests. And this, they wouldn't have said that this was unlawful. David was the anointed of God, and he was running from Saul at this point, and he had nothing to eat. And so he ate of the bread in the temple, and they wouldn't have saw a problem with this, because he was the anointed of God, the rightful heir of the throne. And so Jesus' connection here is quite interesting, because you go from wheat to bread first off, which is obviously very, very close in comparison. Of you have these hungry people who are following God, doing what is right, and then they're hungry, and so they eat. But in this case with the disciples, the Pharisees have a problem with it. And I mean, if we look back, just take a second to look back to Luke chapter 5, verse 11, speaking of Peter and James and John. And it says, when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. And then speaking of Matthew again in verse 28, he left everything behind and got up and began to follow him. So the disciples here that are following Jesus have left everything behind to follow Christ. They are doing the right thing. They're seeking the right thing. They're seeking the new covenant, which was from right at the end of chapter 5 there. The Jesus that comes to fulfill the law, while the Pharisees are asking these questions of how do you break the Sabbath, and yet the disciples are following the Sabbath as much as they possibly could in that moment. And because Jesus finishes by saying the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying that he himself is why the Sabbath exists. And they kind of, we talked about this a little bit before, but the Sabbath is something that isn't really well understood. I don't think it's understood as something that's, Old Testament-y and law-y and whatever, and we just kind of say, well, Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath, and just kind of, dust our hands of it and leave it alone for the most part. But there's something that's really beautiful about what the Sabbath actually is and how it's fulfilled by Jesus. And because the Sabbath was always meant to point the Israelites to God. It was a day of of remembrance. It was a day of you ceased work, not just to kind of sit around and enjoy life and whatever, but it was a day to actually say, okay, God, I'm not going to work today. And because I'm not working to provide for me, then as you've done in the past, from getting out of Egypt to through the desert, all of those things, you'll have to provide for me again. So it's a day of remembering the provision of God and sitting in humble expectation of the continued provision of God. And in doing that, it's really about worship. It's about worshiping him, knowing that he's going to provide for you even when you're not working for your provisions. But when Jesus says he is Lord of the Sabbath, what he's saying is that all of these kind of rules that the Pharisees came up with to put guardrails kind of around the Sabbath, they don't matter. They're not the point, because they've made not working as the point of the Sabbath. They missed the actual point of what the Sabbath is, that it is of the worship of God. And so Jesus is saying, I'm here as the Lord of the Sabbath. And what you're doing is you're saying, you're questioning everything. You're fighting against it. You're not taking in the new covenant that I'm bringing. Instead, you're resisting it. But he says, the disciples there are walking with the Lord, and they obviously didn't have everything. They didn't know everything, and they didn't have a full understanding. They didn't have everything right, obviously, but they understood enough to leave everything behind and to follow him. And he's the one that we worship. And so when Jesus says that when we think of Jesus as having fulfilled the Sabbath, we should think of it as the sense of really opening up the Sabbath. And instead of having a day when we rest of our work and worship him in remembrance and expectation, we now have every day of the week, every day of our lives, to not to cease working. Obviously, we're told to work, but to sit in the rest of God that we talked about if you missed it, it was a few weeks ago. We talked about, well, a couple months ago probably now, we talked about the rest of God. To sit in that rest every moment of every day, to sit in humble expectation, remembering everything that he has done, and expecting him to do so much more, waiting for him to do so much more, and doing our part in that. So we're not just we're not focusing on what we are doing or what we aren't doing, but we're resting in him, we're worshiping him, we're building our relationship with him, and we're trusting in him, and we're relying on him. And so when Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, we understand that he's not just he doesn't just get one day, but he gets every day of our lives, so that we worship him every moment of our lives and put our trust ultimately in him. I'll see you next week.